Okay, let's get into it. We're doing a deep dive today into, well, a really heavy case. It's one that's generated so much discussion for decades now, the West Memphis Three.
It really has. Decades of headlines, documentaries, public campaigns. It's quite a story.
And for this deep dive, we're focusing on a single source. It's a detailed encyclopedia entry. It really lays out the whole timeline, the people involved, the legal mess, everything.
Yeah, it provides a solid framework, a comprehensive look from start to, well, where things stand now.
So our mission today is to walk you through that information. We want to pull out the key details, the twists and turns, and really understand what this source tells us about this complicated and frankly often frustrating case.
Absolutely. Helping you get a clear picture based on this overview.
So according to our source, where does this whole thing begin?
It starts back in May 1993, West Memphis, Arkansas.
Right, May 6th specifically. That's when three little boys, 8 years old, Chris Byers, Stevie Branch, and Michael Moore, they were found.
Yeah, found in a drainage dish filled with water.
Yeah.
In the woods near Robin Hood Hills, they'd been reported missing less than a day before.
In the scene described in the source, it's just horrific. The boys were naked, they were beaten, hogtied.
And there's that one incredibly disturbing detail the source makes sure to note. Chris Byers had been castrated.
What's immediately strange, though, and the source points this out, is how little evidence was actually found there, considering how violent it was.
Exactly. Very little blood, not many fibers. The source even mentions it looked like the area might have been, I don't know, swept clean somehow. Very odd.
And given those details, the woods, the naked bodies, the hog tying, that specific mutilation, it maybe seems less surprising, though still problematic, that this idea of a satanic cult started spreading.
Right. The source clearly states that those details really fueled that theory among locals and the police. Chief Inspector Gary Gitchell even publicly said they were considering cult activity early on.
And the source makes a crucial point here. This focus on the cult theory, it kind of overshadowed other possibilities.
Yeah, like, more standard lines of investigation, maybe someone who knew the boys. That seemed to get less attention because of the immediate cult panic.
Which, looking back through the lens of this source, feels like a really big deal. That early focus seems to have steered everything.
It definitely seems that way. It heavily influenced who the police started looking at.
So who did they zero in on based on this cult angle?
3 local teenagers, Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley Jr.
Okay, tell us about them based on the source.
Well, Damien Echols, he was already kind of on the police radar. He was under supervision for burglary, some sexual misconduct charges mentioned in the source.
And his probation officer, Jerry Driver, the source says he thought Echols was into cult stuff.
Yeah, Driver apparently told police he suspected Echols was involved in a cult based on their interactions. Echols denied Satanism, but admitted he practiced magic, so Driver passed those suspicions along.
Okay, so Echols fits their developing theory. What about Jason Baldwin?
Baldwin was Echols' friend. The source paints him as a bit of a social outcast, but smart, did well in school. Importantly, it says he didn't participate in Echols' magic stuff, but they hung out a lot.
And Jessie Misskelley Jr.
He's described as having very little connection to Echols or Baldwin before all this, almost separate.
So how does Misskelley get drawn into this picture if he wasn't really part of that duo?
That seems to involve a woman named Vicki Hutchison. The source says she volunteered to help the police. She also had Misskelley babysit for her, and she started asking him about the case.
Okay.
And according to the source, Hutchison allegedly introduced Misskelley to Echols. Remember, Echols was already a suspect. Then Hutchison told the police this story about going to a witches' gathering with both of them.
Wow. Okay, so that leads to Misskelley being questioned.
Right. They bring him to the station. He's questioned for hours. But the source specifically notes only about 30 minutes of it was actually recorded.
Just 30 minutes recorded out of several hours? That seems notable.
It does. And during that recorded part, Misskelley confesses. He implicates himself, Echols, and Baldwin in the murders.
But the source immediately points out problems, right?
Huge problems. It says the confession was inconsistent with the known facts of the crime scene. It even contradicted itself at different points. Major red flags.
Yet, despite those inconsistencies...
Despite all that, police arrested all 3 teenagers on June 3rd, 1993, based largely on that confession.
And Misskelley, what did he do after confessing?
He recanted almost immediately. The source says he told people he was confused during the questioning, that he was just trying to cooperate without really getting what he was saying or what it meant.
Okay, so a recanted, inconsistent confession. And this brings us to another major point the source emphasizes leads that weren't followed up on.
Exactly. This becomes a huge point of criticism later. Two things really stand out in the source. First, there was blood found on a knife that used to belong to John Mark Byers.
Chris Byers' stepfather.
Right. And tests showed the blood was consistent with both Chris Byers and Mark Byers. But the police, they just didn't pursue it.
Wait, consistent with both the victim and the stepfather on his knife? And they didn't pursue it? That's hard to understand.
It really is, reading it in the source. The second lead involved a local Bojangles restaurant. An employee saw a guy come in the night the boys vanished, disoriented, covered in mud and blood.
Mud and blood.
Yeah, he used the restroom, left blood smears. Police took samples, the source says. But they never followed up on that lead either. And eventually the evidence was just lost.
They lost the evidence from the Bojangles.
Completely lost it, according to the source. Just gone.
So these major unpursued leads, the recanted confession, but the trials went ahead anyway in 1994.
They did. Misskelley was tried separately because he'd confessed. The prosecution hoped he'd repeat it on the stand against the others.
Did he?
No. The source says he refused. Wouldn't repeat his statements, wouldn't testify against Echols and Baldwin.
So his trial starts January 94. Echols and Baldwin's trial starts about a month later.
Correct. February 28th for them. Both trials got a ton of media attention. And the source mentions there were legal fights over what evidence could even be presented.
And the evidence that was presented against them, what was the nature of it, according to the source?
Largely circumstantial, is how the source describes it. It specifically calls out testimony from a supposed cult expert.
A cult expert? What did they testify about?
Things like the defendant's taste in music, heavy metal, their clothing choices, wearing black, trying to link all that to satanic activity.
Wow. So that initial cult theory really carried all the way through the trial.
It seems like it permeated everything. The source also brings up potential issues with the defense attorneys, suggesting they maybe didn't effectively counter some things or present evidence like the police investigation flaws or the recantation effectively. Could have been strategy, could have been rulings by the judge.
And the verdicts?
Guilty. All three found guilty by the juries.
What were the sentences?
Life in prison for Misskelley and Baldwin. Misskelley got an extra 40 years on top of that. And Damien Echols, he was sentenced to death.
Death sentence. For a teenager. Based on what the source describes as circumstantial evidence and a shaky, recanted confession, that must have kicked off a lot of appeals.
Oh, absolutely. Years and years of appeals followed. They argued trial misconduct, brought up new evidence as it emerged, and some of the original case started falling apart outside the courtroom, too.
Like what?
Remember Vicki Hutchison? The woman who linked to Misskelley and Echols and talked about the witches gathering?
Yeah.
She later came forward and said she lied on the stand, committed perjury. She claimed the police told her what to say.
Whoa, that's huge. A key witness recanting like that.
Definitely undermines the original prosecution case. The source also mentions accusations of juror misconduct. Apparently, the jury foreman had been discussing the case details with his own personal lawyer all throughout the trial.
Seriously, talking to an outside lawyer during the trial, that sounds completely improper.
Highly improper. So you have recanted testimony, potential juror misconduct, serious problems.
And then came the DNA evidence, right? That felt as a turning point.
Absolutely crucial. DNA testing, which wasn't as advanced back in '93, was eventually done on evidence from the crime scene. And it found DNA that matched Terry Hobbs.
Terry Hobbs, Stevie Branch's stepfather, one of the victim's stepfathers.
Exactly. That DNA match, combined with the evidence of juror misconduct, was what finally convinced the Arkansas Supreme Court to order a new hearing.
So after all those years locked up, Echols still on death row. This new evidence finally opened a door. And this is also when public support really ramped up, wasn't it?
It really exploded. Documentaries like Paradise Lost played a huge role. They weren't initially made to exonerate, just document, but they showed so many questionable things that it galvanized people.
And that website, Free the West Memphis Three.
Yeah, started by friends from California, Burke Soles, Kathy Backen, Grove Pashley. The source says they visited the men, got convinced they were innocent, and set up the site to share information and raise money for the defense. It was really influential.
Plus the book Devil's Knot.
Right, by journalist Mara Leverett. She did a deep dive, concluded it was a tragedy and a gross miscarriage of justice. The source notes she felt compelled to write it partly because officials seemed resistant to a truly honest look at what happened.
And celebrities got involved too.
They did. Eddie Vedder was a big supporter, even visited Echols on death row, used his concerts to raise awareness. Johnny Depp, Natalie Maines from the Dixie Chicks, they all lent their voices in support.
So all this public pressure, the new legal possibilities, it leads to this big moment in 2010.
Yes, the Arkansas Supreme Court orders that hearing, November 2010, specifically to look at this new potential exonerating evidence.
Echols got a new defense team around then too, right? Stephen Braga and Patrick Benka.
He did. And as they prepared for this crucial hearing, the sources say realized something important. While the new evidence, like the Hobbs DNA match, was really strong, it was still, legally speaking, circumstantial, meaning it pointed strongly towards someone else, but it wasn't absolute slam-dunk proof that Hobbs did it and the three didn't. Not quite enough, perhaps, to guarantee they'd win a completely new trial.
Ah, okay, so even with the DNA, there was still risk involved in a new trial.
Exactly. That's the dilemma the source outlines. They were convinced their clients were innocent, but a new trial is always a gamble. So they looked for another way. Attorney Patrick Benka apparently knew the state attorney general, Dustin McDaniel.
And they started talking, negotiating.
That's what the source indicates. Benka argued the juror misconduct alone should grant them new trials. And out of those discussions came this idea, the Alford plea.
Okay, the Alford plea. This is so central to how things ended, legally at least. Explain what that is based on the source.
Right. The source explains it clearly. An Alford plea is where a defendant pleads guilty to lesser charges. But, and this is key, they don't admit they actually committed the crime. They explicitly maintain their innocence on the record.
So they say, I plead guilty, but also I didn't do it. How does that work?
They plead guilty essentially because they acknowledge the prosecution have enough evidence that they can be convicted at trial, and pleading is strategically in their best interest, maybe to get a lesser sentence, or in this case, immediate release.
So it's a way out, avoiding the risk of trial for both sides.
Exactly. The state avoids potentially losing, having the convictions overturned, maybe having to reinvestigate. The defendants avoid the risk of being found guilty again, staying in prison, or for Echols, facing execution.
The source highlights Jason Baldwin's situation here, though. It must have been incredibly tough for him.
Yeah, he hadn't confessed like Misskelley. He wasn't facing death like Echols. Pleading guilty, even an Alford plea, meant accepting a conviction for murders he insisted he didn't commit, a permanent record.
What made him agree?
According to the source, his primary motivation was to save Damien Echols' life. Echols' execution was looming, and this plea deal was the fastest way to get him off death row and get everyone out.
So they all agreed.
They did. On August 19, 2011, Judge David Laser accepted the Alford pleas. They pleaded guilty to lesser charges, stated their innocence for the record, and were sentenced to time served 18 years. And then they walked free.
The source calls it a strange, semi-permanent close to the case.
Strange feels right. Free, yes. But legally still convicted felons, just for lesser charges, not exonerated. And the source stresses that the original case itself, still unresolved. And the actions of the police and prosecutors, relatively unexamined.
That's a really critical point. The state won't reinvestigate the murders now.
Nope. Case closed for them.
Yeah.
And the source also points out because they technically pleaded guilty, none of them, Echols, Baldwin, and Misskelley, can get compensation for the 18 years they spent wrongfully in prison. They might never be fully cleared legally.
So the question of who really killed those boys is officially just left hanging. But the story didn't end there.
Not by a long shot. Media attention continued. There's another documentary, West of Memphis. In 2012, Peter Jackson and Echols himself were involved in producing that. The movie, based on Devil's Nod, got made. Echols published his memoir, Life After Death.
And the legal fight continued too, specifically over DNA testing.
Yes, this is the most recent chapter, covered right at the end of our source material. In 2021, Echols' lawyers formally requested access to the remaining crime scene evidence. They wanted to use new, much more sensitive DNA testing methods.
Was the evidence still around? I remember hearing it might have been lost.
There were initial reports like that, yeah, concerns it was lost or destroyed. But the source clarifies it was later found, mostly intact. So Echols sued to get access for this new testing.
Did the court agree?
Not initially. A circuit judge, Tanya Alexander, ruled against him in June 2022. So his team appealed to the Arkansas Supreme Court in January 2023.
And groups like the Innocence Project kept pushing for the testing too.
Right. public pressure continued. They argued, let the science speak.
Which leads us to a really big development. Very recently, April 18th, 2024.
A landmark ruling from the Arkansas Supreme Court. They decided that entering an Alford plea does not prevent someone from using a specific Arkansas Law Act 1780 of 2001.
And what does Act 1780 do?
The source explains it allows anyone convicted of a crime, and the court ruled the Alford plea counts as a conviction for this purpose, to petition the court to overturn that conviction if new scientific evidence can establish their actual innocence.
Wow. So even though they took the Alford plea, the state Supreme Court is saying they still have the right under this law to pursue testing that could prove they didn't do it.
Precisely. It's a huge deal. It basically reopens the door for Echols to get that enhanced DNA testing done on the remaining evidence. It keeps the fight for potential exoneration alive years after the plea deal seemed to close it.
It's just incredible how this case keeps evolving, and the source material, it really captures the strong feelings people have about it.
Oh yeah. You see the frustration about the initial investigation, the police work, the misleads, that knife belonging to the stepfather, the bloody guy at the Bojangles. People cited in the source are still angry those weren't pursued properly.
And the feeling that the real killer might still be out there.
That hangs over everything. And the source also mentions reactions to the initial denial of the new DNA testing after the Alford plea. Like, how can you block someone who maintains innocence from using science that might finally prove it?
It really highlights that feeling of injustice, that lack of true resolution for so many people, even with the legal outcome of the plea.
Absolutely. It shows that gap that can exist between a legal solution and the pursuit of actual truth or public certainty.
What a journey this source has taken us on, from that horrific crime, the incredibly fast arrests based on, well, what the source terms circumstantial evidence, and that flawed, recanted confession.
Through all the years of appeals, the amazing public support that grew, that complex Alford plea that brought freedom but not exoneration.
And now, right up to this ongoing fight for DNA testing, bolstered by that very recent Supreme Court ruling.
It really forces you to grapple with the complexities of the justice system. That central paradox of the Alford plea, guilty but innocent, a legal tool for release that leaves the biggest question unanswered, at least officially.
So thinking about this latest ruling, the one allowing the new DNA testing, what does this whole saga, as laid out in our source, make you consider about justice? About how powerful public advocacy can be over decades? And about that relentless search for truth, even when the legal system seems to have reached its conclusion? It makes you wonder, what happens next when science might finally offer answers the law couldn't?
It's a question that still hangs heavy over West Memphis, a story far from over.